Hello, welcome to the program. Ahead, we'll meet the woman behind the new look Weekend Australian magazine, find out why media stocks have copped a hiding of late, and hear the story behind Kmart's new advertisement from the man who runs it, Guy Rosso. Rupert Murdoch's long-serving editors has been arrested on suspicion of phone hacking and making cash payments to police. Stuart Kuttner was managing director of News of the World until he resigned 2 years ago. He authorised the paper's spending and worked on several high-profile campaigns against pedophiles. His home has been searched. Former News International executive Rebecca Brooks told an inquiry last month he would have known about payments to private detectives. Let's get the latest on this with James Manning, editor and publisher of Mediaweek. James, just last week we were saying this story had dropped off the front pages, but it's sort of come back again. Yeah,
it's still going on. I think there'll be things, the police investigations are underway in the UK when they find enough evidence. I think this is the 11th arrest we've had now, so that those things keep going. The other interesting thing this week to come out, I thought, was a lot of former News of the World staff who I think been given about a 3 or 4 months payment are finding it difficult to get employment. When they mention where they're from, a lot of the employers are reacting negatively, and there's been a little bit of talk about a legal action against the News International.
Obviously that, and at any point when there's a large round of redundancies in the media, that it's not that big an industry. It's flooded with people, and then suddenly there's not enough places to soak everyone up. Meantime, the Prime Minister met with editors and executives from News Limited newspapers on Tuesday night. Julia Gillard attended the meeting at News Limited offices at the invitation of the company's CEO John Hartigan. The Prime Minister had earlier said she expected to talk to News about her vision for the future and the government's reform agenda. Neither party divulged many details. News Limited saying the conversation was free and frank on both sides. Let's return to James Manning and our special guest for the program, Christine Middup, who's the editor of the Weekend Australian magazine. Christine, I won't ask you to spill any of the secrets from the meeting. I'm sure you wouldn't anyway. But the Weekend Australian magazine is all new and fresh. What was wrong with the old version?
There was absolutely nothing wrong with the old version, but you can't keep doing the same thing time in and time out. I think you really always have to critically look at your magazine. You have to assess whether it's meeting the market, whether it could be doing better, and whether you can attract new readers and advertisers with a different offering, and we've decided to do that. But I think the other reality is that new editors want to do new things, so that's been true for me as well.
You're a bit of a specialist in certain magazines. You come from Q Weekend, of course, the Courier Mail Saturday magazine. Are they becoming an increasingly important part of the offering to readers? As papers have been under pressure by other, digital offerings or entertainment.
Look, I think they're incredibly important to a newspaper because, for the cover price of a newspaper, you get a magazine which is full of some of the best writing in the country, some of the best photography, great columnists. We extend our offering, so, I think it's better than newsstand magazines, not surprisingly.
Tell us what you are changing in there.
Well, we're going to a big format, so it's about 25% bigger, so that is fantastic for me because it means that we can really display the sorts of pictures that I like to run. It means that we can get in the big long-form journalism, which is very much a tradition and a valued tradition of the Weekend Australian magazine. So that will be the first thing I think that readers will notice. We've changed the masthead, we've changed the whole sort of design of the magazine to give it a much more contemporary look and feel, and we've introduced some new columnists and some new sections as well.
You've previously been serving like a Brisbane-only audience. Now you've got the whole country. Is that daunting at all?
Look, it is daunting, and I've often said that I started out as a young journalist about the same time the Weekend Australian magazine was launched, so I've always watched it and admired it and respected it, so I sort of feel the weight of responsibility, I must say. But I think that a story is a good story, and what I always try to do is look for the universal truth in a story, so it doesn't really matter to me whether it's a story from Cape York or Macquarie Island. There is a universal truth or humanity or something about that story which makes that story work, and it doesn't really matter where you live or what you what you think of that.
How competitive is it on the journalism side now for people who want to do this sort of writing? Because you talk to a lot of the print journos. I mean, I know I talk to a lot of them in finance, and their day in day out is they've got one story that they have to file by the paper's deadline, but in the meantime they've got 3 or 4 others that they have to do for online, and the luxury of doing anything long form with a lot of research is kind of being pulled back. So I imagine something that's getting even bigger would be would be really interesting to a lot of people in the industry.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, every reporter wants to be in the magazine. Every reporter wants a splash. I mean, they're the two things I think that you really do aim for. I mean, fortunately, the Weekend Australian and the Australian, they do run long-form journalism all the time. So I've got a whole sort of, you know, staff for the magazine, but also across the paper who are very used to doing that, which is great. But it's absolutely the gig you want if you're a writer.
Will the sort of editorial tone of the magazine change at all? I mean, the Australian's not known as a sort of place to go for celebrity profiles and that. Will we see much of that in the magazine, and will it be politically as sort of strong as the newspaper is?
Well, look, I think we need to have a bit of a point of difference to the newspaper. So I think that, you know, the decision makers and the big spenders very much go to the Australian and the Weekend Australian newspaper, and that's fine. Obviously, we want them to come to the magazine as well, but we need to really broaden our offering so that the way I look at it is I try to think about, you know, picking up a number of people in a particular household so that the, you know, the husband will read it, the wife will read it, and probably the older kids will read it as well. So I think it should be quite a broad magazine. I'm personally not really, I don't love celebrity profiles unless that person has something to say. Quite often they don't, and the reality is you can't get access, the proper access to celebrities anymore to do the sorts of profiles that we really need to do. So if there is a celebrity profile in the magazine, then you can bet that they've got something to say and there is something new about it. Otherwise, I just don't want to run it.
How would you see yourself differing from the Good Weekend, the Fairfax offering? Obviously, you know, with the women's magazines and in TV, where you've got ACCA and Today Tonight, they're all quite similar, really, and they all chase the same kind of stories. Do you guys chase the same sort of features, or is it...
Look, not so often. I mean, I've only been at the Weekend Australian magazine for a few months now, but I certainly haven't sensed that at all, and I didn't sense it when I was on Q Weekend. So I think if you looked at it on a spectrum, you know, Good Weekend would be in the more sort of, you know, entertainment probably sphere, and we would probably be along the more sort of serious side of that. I think that's a good place for us. There's no point us sort of trying to fight in that sort of middle ground. We really need to keep our spot and defend our turf, I suppose.
You've had sort of promotional materials out for the new magazine. I think you did a dummy edition. Have you been involved in sort of taking that to advertisers, and what's been the feedback?
Yep, so I have been involved in taking it to advertisers, and the feedback has been, you know, universally fantastic. I think that the bigger size has really engaged advertisers, which is great because obviously that gives them a better format to display the things that they want to display.
You're going to charge them more for the bigger ad?
No, that's no rates stay the same, so that's value. But look, they were very supportive, and our launch issues are very well supported with advertising, so we're very grateful for that, and I think it just sort of shows that the offering we've got is pretty well right.
Just finally, I guess, on the editorial front, I mean, all the editors of all the News Limited publications are constantly being asked at the moment about whether they really are under pressure from Rupert or be it whoever to push a certain line. Have you felt that, or do you kind of hear that and just laugh?
Never. No, I've been at News Limited for, what, probably 12 or 13 years, and look, that's just nothing that I've ever experienced at all, and I've operated in quite senior roles, so, you know, it's a pretty independent do-it-yourself show.
Kristen, thank you.
Thank you.
Good to meet you. Let's turn now to media stocks, which for the most part have copped a hiding over the last week. Fears of a consumer spending meltdown impacting on forecasts for advertising spend. With the latest, here's Chris Weston from IG Markets in Melbourne.
Yeah, good afternoon. Certainly we have seen a loss of confidence coming through, and we've seen a slowdown in the domestic economy, and that really has hurt domestic stocks and also media stocks quite dramatically. Let's look at the price action in the last month. I mean, SEEK's been the ultimate beneficiary. It's actually done very well. It's down 1.3% in the last month. But let's look at the other stocks. Ozstar's down 24%. Obviously, they've had issues there. News Corp's down about 12%. We know the issues that those guys have been having. But let's look at the other stocks. 10 down 12%. We're seeing APN down about 18%, and Fairfax down about 14%. If we focus in the US, where we've obviously seen a slowdown in GDP, we've seen personal spending being cut, advertising revenues expected to grow about 3 to 4% this year. Now, if you look at the actual cable TV network and the advertising spend going there, which is obviously what News Corp's very much leveraged to, we are expected to see that grow about 8.3% this year. Now, that's down from 11% last year, and the slowdown is expected to continue to about 5.6%, but that's been quite a strong area. If you look at magazine revenue from advertising spend, they're actually expected to fall 4.2%, and we're expecting to see further declines in 2012, about 3.4%. So I know it's unrelated to the phone hacking scandal, but certainly magazines taking the brunt there. If you look at the domestic economy, we know it's weak. David Jones came out with some very, very poor sales numbers recently. We know the actual top retailers make up about 20% of all media spend, advertising spend. So until we get clarity from the earnings season, we are expected to see further trading conditions for these media stocks under pressure. You can clearly see that advertising spend has slowed slowed down recently. If you look at the advertising revenue or the advertising spend in the 6 months up until June, that's averaged about 2.4%. Now the 6 months up until the end of last year, we saw that around about 8.5%. So we've seen a marked slowdown, and notably in the outdoor and magazine divisions, hence why APN's been doing quite poorly. But we have seen a sharp pullback in terms of earnings per share. If you look at PEs now across the board on the stocks that I named, you are seeing between 7 and 9 times earnings, which is actually very cheap. You're seeing free cash flow yields of between 15 and 20%. You're seeing dividend yields on some of the stocks around 10%. So we do expect to see a little bit of support. We've got earnings season coming out next week, and we know that companies have given guidance. I think the advertising revenue visibility that the CEOs are going to give is quite poor, so we don't expect to see a huge amount of upside. But just looking at the domestic economy, it's still very weak, and hence why the credit markets are pricing in 3 rate cuts over the next 12 months. So we don't expect a huge amount of upside in the short term, but confidence has been lost, and these stocks are under some serious pressure.
Chris Weston there. Let's go back to James Manning and check in on some of the other big stories around the media traps this week. James, we've just obviously been hearing about the relaunched Australian, but one of our other print offerings is being relaunched.
Yeah, New Idea, the weekly magazine from the 7 West Media Group. It's come out with a bit of a makeover this week. The cornerstone, I think, of the change they've made, they've put in a 24-page food book. So every week they'll be publishing a food book, recipes, stuff like that. Obviously a very hot sector at the moment for magazines, and we talked last week, of course, about the launch of Feast. That's also come out by Pacific, so they're getting into food.
In a couple of months, will they insert a 24-page renovation book?
Well, they don't have a dedicated renovation show at the moment, so perhaps not. And of course, we should mention the return of Nene King to magazines too. Back to her home. I think she started at New Idea under Dulcie Bowling years ago, before she went and built Woman's Day into a significant competitor. So she's come back as their advice columnist. Yeah, so she's been through a bit in the last few years, financial, personally. So
who better to ask? Absolutely. Who better to ask? MX Melbourne, a bit of an anniversary.
Yep, 10 years already since that launched. It was this time 10 years ago. I think both Fairfax and Herald and Weekly Times, those days in Victoria, both put commuter dailies into the market. News Limited's sort of survived, Fairfax's didn't. So it's 10 years later. MX has since launched editions in Brisbane and Sydney. They're also successful.
Yep. Now, still on papers, I suppose, the Pan Per Newspaper of the Year Awards, they come out in a couple of weeks, but they've released the nominees.
There's a real lot of nominations. They've increased it even more this year. So I think it's something like 60 different categories, and that covers newspapers, marketing awards.
Are we going to have to sit through all those on the night?
Photography, highly, it's a wonderful night. You see lots of achievers being rewarded. The big award, of course, is for newspapers with circulations over 90,000.
Okay.
And again, that's most of the Australian dailies. You know, the West Australian, the Advertiser, Herald Sun, the Age. They're all nominated. One who didn't crack it this year was the Australian. I'm not sure, wasn't able to find out if they actually didn't enter this year or they just didn't make the list of finalists. Also a couple of New Zealand papers in there. But it's an award that's been won twice by a lot of papers in the past decade. So I think the Sydney Morning Herald has won it a couple of times, Courier Mail. I think the Australian's won twice. So it'll be interesting to see who gets the nod this year.
Well, we'll be there in a couple of weeks talking to all the big players. Let's move on to radio. Some changes at ARN.
Yep, they've appointed a new content director, they call them these days. I'm still tempted to call them program directors, but they're content directors these days, so to cover stuff that goes online as well. A guy called Chris Cotton, he's come across from Breeze in, I think it was in Wellington. It's a station in New Zealand anyway. But nothing wrong with the business they're doing in Adelaide. That's probably ARN's best market, with Mix over there, sort of often the #1 FM station.
Yeah. Now, you've spoken about Sam Thompson before moving around, so formerly of DMG Radio in Melbourne.
Yeah, general manager down there.
Now joining MCM Media.
Yeah, taking on a sort of a national content role, something she's pretty good at. I think she's more at the content side than the sort of sales or marketing, if you like. She's working under a new CEO there, Simon Joyce. He's been on the show before, sort of explained to us what MCM does. It's sort of a company that produces content, gives it to radio stations it's like a barter deal in terms for sort of selling the ad content. So we can expect to see a lot more programs being developed that she'll probably take to market.
One one more story doing the rounds in the radio sector, and that's to do with Nova. They've done a deal with the VRC for Melbourne Cup.
Sure, yeah. So they get the sort of naming rights for, if you like, for the FMs. The FM market anyway. It covers the Derby on the Saturday,
yep.
Cup Day, Oaks Day on the Thursday, finishing up with Stakes Day on the Saturday. They'll have their own marquee down there, so they'll get all their advertisers along, and
they'll need a marquee because it always rains. Yeah. All right, we have to take a break. Coming up on Media Week, Gluey Gruen. Viewers stick with the Gruen transfer. The Will Anderson fronted show returns for another series with north of 1 million viewers.